Welcome to Chapman University's Tabula Poetica series. This fall, we're hosting our events online. We're live streaming on YouTube, which will add closed captions after the event. On YouTube, you can also find videos of previous Tabula Poetica talks and readings, and we encourage you to keep up with us by following Tab Journal on Facebook and Twitter. We're excited to have the opportunity this semester to invite poetry readers from everywhere into this fall's Tabula Poetica conversations. In addition, we've invited students in the classes reading the work of the visiting poets to participate via Zoom. We ask students to keep their microphones muted while the poet is speaking. And for Q&A, students can put questions into the chat or, when called upon, join in with video and audio. I'm Genevieve Kaplan, guest curator for this year's series. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to invite these poets to join the conversation about poetry at Chapman University. Most of the support, both for this series and for Tab Journal, comes from the English department. I want to thank MFA Program Director Anna Leahy, our English Department Chair Joanna Levin, our administrative assistants Kristen Lasko, and especially Samantha De La O, who has been doing so much of the behind the scenes work throughout these events, and graduate assistant Jason Thornberry. This year, Tabula Poetica also received grants from poets and writers to support our visiting poets. Brent Armendinger, tonight's featured reader, was born in Warsaw, New York, and studied at Bard College and the University of Michigan. He is the author of Street Gloss and The Ghost in Us Was Multiplying, both finalists for the California Book Award in Poetry, as well as 2 chapbooks. His poems and translations have appeared in many journals, including Anomaly, Asymptote, Denver Quarterly, Ghost Proposal, Haydn's Ferry Review, Lit, and Puerto del Sol. He has been awarded residencies and fellowships at the Blue Mountain Center, the Community of Writers, Headland Center for the Arts, and Mineral School. Brent teaches creative writing at Pitzer College and lives in Los Angeles. Brent's poems and his approaches to writing and thinking about poetry are always smart and surprising. His work often explores what it means to say or unsay, how we can best navigate our way through the world, or what it means to be an active participant in society. In our class discussions about The Ghost in Us Was Multiplying, my students noted the impressive vocabulary that Brent brings to his poems, the way that his lines unfold and expand in unexpected but often perfect feeling ways. Earlier today, at his craft talk, Brent shared some of his methods for pushing the comfort zone of poetry and allowing doubt to enter the landscape of the poem in order to create bold new work. He described generating and including conversations with community members as part of his translation project in Street Gloss, and he shared some recent work that evolved through spending time carefully and repeatedly observing elements of landscape. Which is all to say that I know I'm very excited to get to listen into tonight's reading and to see where Brent will take us next, and I'm glad that you're all here too. Let's give Brent Armendinger a warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that beautiful and generous introduction, Genevieve. Also, thanks to both you and Anna for bringing me here in this liminal space that we are occupying together. And I'm grateful that we can do that. And thanks all of you for coming. So I think I'll start off by reading a few poems from The Ghost in Us Was Multiplying. So this is what I have been made for. The body keeps asking the body to become a zero or a sum. This is the lesson of intimacy. This is the lesson of less than me. It begins in a quietness sometimes far. A cup on the shelf reveals my body to be sand. Too late to fire it in the kiln. Impossible to drink from, I fill it up with water. Where did I go, says the boy who has never been a boy. A hole in the wood becomes a church. Like scaffolding, the mountain I cannot climb, the cup I cannot drink from, and this somehow relieves me. I cling to my beliefs. Nothing makes it not a mountain. I know afraid is so like scaffolding. I know the hole in me is where a steeple would be. I can sleep here after the last of the cinders cool. A ladder leans against a ladder longingly, but shall not climb on thee. This is what I have been made for to walk across a roofless me made of breath and not of wood. When it tumbles, less than sky is God's ambivalence. Casual sex. You're not to whom it may concern, but whom could make an opening in him like the smoke in this language I intrude upon while he, blubbering of heart, was all too tucked inside the minus sign I strung around my neck. How much longer could I hold my head up to look at him, the blackout in me jingling, him of dog leash, of muzzle, climbing in reverse like a thief through my cartoon window? I found him like I find everything, on my way home from the euphemism on the wrong side of town, the mouth inside of brick where night can go on being night until it finally passes out inside some other animal's ambition. That's where I buried the clocks, in case you're wondering, the coils inside them, stammered. Meanwhile, the nightingales go at it, declaiming their anthem for my face as I wipe it clean of every hymn inside that oubliette. It isn't hard to fall inside of falling. My hymn inside of him makes me you, a double preposition, a corridor in briefly, the mind outside the mind in me. And I'm going to read one more from, thank you. I'm going to read one more from the book, or from the first book. So this is called xeriscaping, which refers to a method of drought-tolerant planting. It's a word that I didn't know until I moved to Southern California, I guess 12 years ago now. Okay. Xeriscaping. The quietness after fucking filled the room with moths. A moth is when we stopped breathing long enough to be alive. What if X equals all the winged zeros we forgot on the way to how old we are, divided by a drought? 1,000 exhalations to spend the way we choose. What if we could? 1,000 breaths a day. The remainder as what's human. A moth wakes up inside a piano like hearing without a mouth. Wild was the wind, a radio uninterrupted by air. Out there is unwritten, a noise. Inside is embarrassed and very late, like a hospital. All those zeros falling down from the sky when a moth goes back to sleep. The problem with breath is not a metaphor. The poet could live an hour or so outside his iron lung, maybe twice a week or only once a month. The problem with an hour, the problem with a zero. Above our heads, we hold our metaphors, umbrellas fading in the sun, trying to steer it. It's practically desert, the slow, forgetful sky. I came to you by walking south, mailing my blood back north, knowing it would dry on my return address before it stain your hand. A stain, my zero, not the color you live in, but a bridge of wings to walk across, or a minefield. Behind a window, what is a friend outside the window, a bridge inside an envelope? Oh, friend, what is a wing, a flat star to press against your face? Careful not to bury it, careful in the thaw. Sometimes it's only memory that listens hard, the wing or train fall down. Sometimes it's only winter to not relent a leaf. This bruise is who's inside it. You put me on your shelf, a hospital for moths. Carefulness in the bruise, involuntary thaw. Under the freeway, you can sell your breath for a bucket of water, then pour the water in the river we turned upside down. The we that wasn't born here, a hand-me-down, a parable. Thank you. So now, first I'm going to drink some water. But now I'm going to read from my second book, Street Gloss. And I understand that some of you here have read it, but I will say a little bit about it for those who haven't. So this book is based on a site-specific experimental translation project based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And basically I translated poems by contemporary Argentinian writers on the streets of the city. And so I initially translated this work without a dictionary, and that left a number of words I didn't know. And then I went out searching for the definitions of those words in the streets of the city. I created this procedure to do it. And basically it involved having conversations with strangers about their own associations with words, and also noting the impressions and physicality of the space around me, and then collaging this into definitions that accompany the translations themselves. I know that's that's a mouthful for me as well, but I'm gonna read to you from kind of a sampling of definitions for each of the poems that I translated. And I'm going to actually share my screen. While I do this, so I'm going to include some photographs from the walks in which the poems were in which the initial process took place, and then you'll also see some of the notes that I took from my walks that I then drew from in order to make these prose poem definitions. So this is Sasude, and it comes from a poem by Alejandro Mendez's Ciudades Tres. Sasude, Catamarca e Independencia. You have to push really hard to make things move, she says, to not get bored or to deal with the feelings. Her language buckles the definite article to sensation. Etymologically, an emotion is an arrow pointing outward. But what of the arrows inside the atmosphere? From the roof of a nearby apartment building, a cellular tower rises. My consciousness gets heavy, coated with burnt parts of meteorite, unspoken thoughts, pollen, hair, and conversations falling out of orbit. What if the feelings I call my own have fallen upon me like particles of dust? My loneliness has a diameter of less than 500 micrometers. I walk susceptible to the uneven ground of my invention, where the roots of a tree are breaking pavement, pushing so hard to unbelong here. And then these next two definitions are from therefore Mercedes Raffé's poem Situación para romper un hechizo, situation to break a spell. And this is Hechizo. Paseo Colón y Cochabamba. My friend told me about this place, the night half excavated underneath the autopista. The guidebook does not mention it. He's in his studio, painting a boy he knows, the curse or spell of beauty. He waits for the face to dry and then paints over it with white. I hold a brush in my outstretched arm, a mirror or a magnifying glass. The guidebook falls asleep. I want to ask each passerby to pass it over me until I'm gone enough. The paper bodies of the detained begin to climb the beams. What holds the traffic in place? There is no cover from the sound of it, the smell of diesel, the vibration of these passages. The light shocks them out of shadows and glues them to the wall. They are photocopies of photocopies. An officer is here to guard them. I ask him what it means. In his orange vest, he sways back and forth in the ground beneath his definition. It has something to do with magic, he says, like to get a girl to fall in love with you. There is a softness in his throat, but I sway on the uniform beneath his uniform, the half-excavated night. There is no cover from the sound of them, the curse or spell plastered on the wall. And then this is Onda, also from the same poem by Mercedes Rofe. Onda, Umberto I y Balcarce. And when I'm saying that, that's actually the intersection where I was while gathering the definition. Onda. On the face of the no longer patronato, the word for childhood is covered with weeds. In the broken window hangs a photograph of ice, the elsewhere of a continent, a translucent advertisement. The word for Antarctica is Antarctica. It swings back and forth in the aftermath of glass. They say photography is the coldest continent, but I can tell that people are squatting here. Their clothing illuminates the string between the empty buildings. I pluck it with my question. A woman walks by and answers me with homophones. It's a motorbike, she tells me, or that you and I, as if she knows me, we have good energy between us. Across the street is the Registro Nacional de las Personas. I empty my pockets in search of the breath of former inhabitants. A person is a string between the homophones. A person is a continent at the bottom of a continent, a window at the bottom of a window, broken from a name. This next one is Bolcro, and it is for Fabián Casas. It's a word from his poem, Los Ciclos, the cycles. Bolcro, Juan Perón y Sánchez de Bustamante. Like a friend, he says, and wipes his hand diagonally across his shirt. What is dirt, if not, there is no tracelessness, a hand that has no name in me? The weeds growing out from the stone facade opposite the doorway, where I record how the disintegrating sound of it becomes indistinguishable from the artificial dark, where I wait for the dirt to pluck the string of me, a weight inside his cart. He stops to talk to me, as if his hand were guided by another hand, entirely. Like my friend, he says, like somebody who is clean. I wait for the dirt to hold my name back, that overripe fruit that swells inside the disintegrating sound of all the names inside of me, to keep my name from spilling out my mouth. Like somebody who is clean, he says, and time grinds down into a powder that will not leave their faces. And this is Galpones, which is also from Fabián Casas's poem. Galpones, Paraguay y Ascuénaga. It is not instantaneous, the act of abandoning a city. I want to make you believe. Time clicks shut for the cartographer. I find myself in a city that existed not 7 months ago, but 3 months earlier than the day I first arrived. My missingness weighs more than I do. Time clicks and I can no longer pronounce my name. I keep walking. But this is where the city ends or else continues through the heavy doors. I push the hospital open to get to its definition, the number flashing red for which ghost or premonition, the he, she, me we stored in here. Inside the empty waiting room, I write a postcard to each of my former lovers. I say, quote, I want to feed you light from inside the slotted windows. I ask them to record themselves while sleeping. I want to play all these recordings at once, to hear them sleeping simultaneously. I place each postcard on an empty chair and walk outside. A young man finally stops for me, his beauty articulating the boundary between his body and the street. I want to feed him light. I want to feed him anything. He says to me, the word is a construction that houses the materials for construction. The he, she, me we stored in here. Like childhood, I think, a word dismantled by the growth of the furniture inside of it. Buenos Aires has amazing graffiti, by the way, and murals. This is Rasada, and it comes from Nestor Berlonger's poem Vapores. Rasada, Plaza Lavache. On the wall behind the swing set, graffiti makes its demand. Saquen sus rosarios de nuestros ovarios. I have never held a rosary, but it still hangs around my neck, the violence of religion. As a child, I won a prize for memorizing psalms, hoping to kill the weeds in me. Now, I'm a forager, collecting them with ink and paper. A stranger sees me writing and asks me for the time. It's 15 after 2. I show him the word in my hand. He tells me it's a color, but my dictionary just points to color's history, the rupture that precedes it. I ask him if it's somewhere around us, and though I think he lives here in this plaza, he says no, no hay nada rosada. And this last definition is huellas, and it comes from Diana Bellesi's Lo que se lleva el viento en su rumor, what the wind carries in its rumor. Huellas, Mario Bravo y Avenida Díaz Vélez. My cartographer skins his knee on the mortality of strangers. He collapses the city between one word and another into the museum of broken sirens. I arrive at the 7th block, where a vine curls around and around this tree, threatening to choke it like a name. I hold my breath. My cartographer is eating language. My cartographer skins his knee. Etymologically, a parasite is a person eating at someone else's table, but we have seen that writing and wood become inseparable. Etymologically, I hold my breath. The name I cannot swallow is spreading, like a vine, into the absence of a window, crowding out the etymology with its unrelenting green. I collapse, I arrive, I cannot swallow, I do not possess. I ask a teenage boy what it means. He makes of his body a pivot. He bends to the ground to put his hand in imaginary concrete. He puts his hand in my hand, and I lower my cartographer into that goodbye, into that wet hollow where he continues walking upside down. And I think I would actually like to, I'm going to read my translation of Diana Bellesi's poem. The way the book is sort of arranged, the way the book is arranged is there's a poem in Spanish, then there's all of the definitions, and then there's the poem in English. You're only going to get a little taste of that tonight, but this is my translation of Bellesi's poem, What the Wind Carries in Its Rumor. Inside or outside, the gaze impoverishes or revives. Minor art, what the wind carries in its rumor, what goes on transforming its essence and leaves imprints to be repeated in variation. Seed at last, Nothing outside the frame the landscape offers I would like for me, for you, my voice of minor art. So perhaps, yes, I could say no to every monument, to let us go after weaving mats with the fragile fibers of the heart. Mats upon which others will dream the incessant dream of being in order to let go of being so sweetly that it cradles the sleep of those who will come, of what's to come. What for? To better the world in minor art, in part trying to erase that pain it suffers and bestows. History, where our error reposes. Which one? Not knowing we only exist in that which we let go. Reverse face of uncertain gain, gaze of the girl who follows us, a lessening of pain. Goldsmithing, where today I would like to leave you, voice of art, minor. And then I'll read a couple of, I think I have time to read a couple of newer poems. I need to drink some water. Thank you all for staying with me. Okay, this is a poem called Meshwork. A heron landed in the shallows of my notebook as I was trying to drag a poem out of the water. The passengers were clapping in relief, in gratitude for the pilot's skill, for the familiar hand of gravity. I walked into the forest. I walked into a net of spun silences. A soft geometry snapped as I moved through it, sticking to my forehead and my fingers. A noise got bent when I pulled it from my mouth. I smoothed it out and strung it up with the others, a wire of not words hanging in the air between my human body and my forest body. The not words said nothing about the forms that rose up all around me. Occasionally, a vowel would fall from a branch and settle on a not word. Occasionally, a consonant would crawl out of the ground. Oh, I had this issue before, so I'm going to cheat and look at something really quickly. Ah, yes, okay. I wrote these poems for trees in the Adirondacks, and I wrote them by visiting the trees, the same 13 trees I visited every day for 30 days and collected language while being alongside these trees. And then after that experience, I collaged the language together into sort of poem portraits for the trees. So this is called Acer Saccharum, sugar maple. In my borrowed hand, I hold a borrowed almost infinity. How it bulges around the rot in the middle of the Anthropocene. Explain to me why I am human and not a leaf curling in on itself until all that's left is light. The lifeboats drop and populate the ground, still gleaming with green stars, with letters yet to be delivered. A bone exposed, what disaster, what scattered from this place and came back animal? What hollowed out a home here, tied around such scar? I think of how the far ones mend the near ones. I think of how mortality, the word enough, the little red blush marks surrounding your name. The leaves overlap, but their translucent mouths crumble into gravity, into who were you when you were the outline of my veins? Like a Venn diagram, a shadow forms a third. The spit of wishing dries, but we keep opening, emitting sound until we recompose. So that is that. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to talk with you more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brent. It was so nice to hear your poems, and thank you for sharing such a great variety too. Like, it was so nice to hear the poems from The Ghost in Us Was Multiplying, the other poems from Street Glass, and some of your newer work. It was just like such a great overview to get. I see that we have some questions popping up in the chat, and I encourage everyone here on Zoom to add some more questions if you are thinking of them now, if you thought of them before but didn't have a chance to write them down. Go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will take a look and see which questions we should start with. If you are also willing to or would like to pop onto the screen and actually say your question to Brent in person, well, in video person, let me know, and we're happy to have you do that too. Otherwise, I can read the questions and we can kind of have a conversation that way. I did want to start, I saw a couple questions about street gloss that I think might be of interest. I'm kind of going to combine these questions from Constance and Kate. So Constance is asking, how did you end up in Buenos Aires? Why did that city appeal to you? And then Kate is asking about your collaborations with the translators. And so I think the question from both of them that we can think about is maybe what attracted you to these poets to begin with? How did you end up in Buenos Aires? And then how did you work with those poets or their words once you were there?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking that. So how did I end up in Buenos Aires? I heard about this project. There's this amazing collective in Buenos Aires called Eloisa Cartonera. And it's this collective of writers and activists who make books by hand and distribute them extremely cheaply. And they're very simple. And I'm sorry, and they're called Cartonera because they have cardboard covers, and they buy the cardboard from the cartoneros, the people on the street who collect cardboard. And so it's this, I think there's a sort of thought of it as a mutual aid, which is really exciting, like literature as mutual aid. And they make these books and they're very cheap. And the reason that they started doing this, sorry, this is long-winded, but the reason they started doing this was after the economic collapse in the, I think 2003, or I lost the date. Basically publishing became untenable for a while. And so this group of people were like, well, what are we gonna do? How can we make this work? So I was extremely interested in that. I had some time to travel. I reached out to them and asked them if I could volunteer with them. And so I went and did that. And while I was there, I also, wanted to do some sort of creative project. And this just sort of emerged over a while. I knew that I wanted to be reading work by contemporary Argentinian writers. I knew I wanted to engage the city in an interesting and creative way. So that's sort of where this came from. I can say that translation was at that point, and still is in some ways, very new to me. And I think part of what I was doing with the project was really sort of trying to trouble the idea, or not trouble, but do something new with translation, and sort of lean into my unknowing, like actually taking my not knowing as the sort of, as what would guide me through. And so this question about the role of the translator, sorry, I'm going on for a while. I think I wanted to push back against this idea of the translator as the perfect expert, as the one who could completely reproduce something. I think it's impossible to reproduce. But you can be alongside something. And that was something I was really interested in. That said, I worked really hard on the actual translations themselves because I wanted to be as faithful as possible. And so the other question is the reception from the Argentinian poets. Positive. These folks are wonderful. I actually was able to read with one of them who now lives a lot of the time in New York. Mercedes Rofe, I was able to read with her last, God, it's hard to believe it was a year ago now, but that was an incredible experience, to read our kind of collaboration together. And then the other folks, you know, I made friends with while I was there. The only person the only person I translated who I didn't meet personally is Nestor Berlonger, because he's no longer alive. But he's a really important queer Argentinian poet whose work I was just so drawn to, and I just didn't want to, I just wanted to translate his work. It's incredibly hard to translate. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. But I worked with his friend Roberto Echevarren, who's also a really important Uruguayan poet and literary critic. So I think I've talked enough. We can go on to the next questions.
Well, I think that this conversation is really fascinating, and now you have generated a lot of follow-up questions. I know we have at least a couple. Constance has one. Constance, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Cool. First, I just wanted to thank you for being here. It's super inspiring to hear like your poetry from you. And I was really, really inspired by this book because I spent a large chunk of my life in Buenos Aires. And so it was really cool to read it from your perspective. And my question was kind of, how did you handle the whole like language thing? Did you already speak Spanish before? Was it kind of a jump in and learn as you go kind of thing? And like my biggest interest in translation is kind of like, how do you handle those untranslatable words?
Yeah, well, I'm so happy to hear that you spent time there and were able to have that other relationship to the book. Where did you live in Buenos Aires?
So I spent over like, it was over multiple years. I spent multiple summers there because my grandma still lives there. She lives in San Isidro, which is like a little outside the city. And then I had an aunt that lived in Palermo, Hollywood.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time there too.
That's great. Oh, and now I need to remember your question. How did I handle language? So I have studied Spanish. I would say that I have sort of intermediate to advanced level Spanish. I can read it pretty well. I can speak it pretty well. And what was I going to say? But I'm not fluent. I'm not fluent, and so. But I knew that I was there, and I wanted to participate as much as I possibly could. So that's the answer to that question. I'm sorry, did you have, I feel like I lost part of your question.
It was basically more asking like, had you studied Spanish before getting there, or did you get there and then learn? And and maybe I'm adding another question to this, but Argentinian Spanish or Castellano is like very different from other parts of the world in Latin America. And so also asking, because I'm guessing if you grew up in the United States, you probably learned a different Spanish. And so, yeah, and how you handle the like words that are so like difficult to translate, especially in poetry.
Yeah, so as I said, like I had studied Spanish all throughout mid-elementary school, high school, some in college, and then I had done some traveling. So I had a good basic foundation. And it's true that Argentinian Spanish is quite different and amusing in some ways. How did I handle the translation of the untranslatable? I mean, I think the person who was the hardest, but also kind of the most exciting was Berlonger, because he makes up words, or he made up words. He also uses like different slang and dialect, and sort of, and also reaching back to like much older versions of Spanish, and mixes it all together. So how did I work with that? I mean, I started just sort of thinking about the multiple possible connotations of words. And then I had to think about them in relationship to each other. And I think that's actually where the work of a poet comes in, you know, because it's somewhat of a puzzle, and you start to understand like how much this has been constructed based on associations, and the kind of vibration that he wanted to create between the words that he's putting together. And so wordplay is very much a part of it. And so like, if I couldn't necessarily have the exact replica, which is not possible, I could create a sensation of that kind of devious play that I think is so much what I find so kind of awesome about that writing.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Oh, devious play is perfect. Like that's what I want to have in everybody's poetry. Yes, I love it.
I wish I was more devious. I love it.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about language, about word choice. I know that Lizeth has a question that I'm going to invite her to ask.
Hi. So I have a question. It's a follow-up question to this last question. In terms of language, were there any words in translation that you found a little bit difficult to work with in terms of the emotional weight of those specific words? At 2:30, you spoke about how it was like when you ask someone a word, people have very different responses as to what that means. But a lot of that could also be because of the memories or the way that those specific words carry. And if there was any issue with translating that emotion.
I mean, that's such a wonderful question. I feel like I need to sit with that question because I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. But yeah, I mean, I'm remembering translating one poem that didn't end up being in the book. And there was a word, I'm trying to remember the word, but it's a word which could be translated as cemetery. And Camposanto. And the woman I talked to about this word went into a really, talked with me for about 10 minutes about her associations of this word. And it was very deep, what she was feeling. And the reason that's not in the book has nothing to do with that exchange. It just didn't end up, I just couldn't put everything in the book, but I remember that. And I remember feeling grateful for how generous she was being. I think it's pretty intense to share this kind of stuff with a total stranger, especially a stranger who's not from where you are, I imagine.
Yeah.
So I don't think that I totally answered your question, but I love the question.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's such a great question. And I think there's another question that I saw in the chat a little bit ago that I want to bring us back to, because I think it might relate a little bit. It's Jana Lee's question. She says the tangible presence of these notes, those handwritten notes that you showed us as you were reading is really wonderful. And I was really struck by the fact that you showed them to us, but they're not included in the actual physical copy of your book, which I think was really interesting. And Jana Lee is asking if these are first drafts, are they transcripts? What is the relationship between those handwritten notes and your experience out on the street, your experience translating, your experience writing the poem? Maybe you could talk with us a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely love the sort of intimacy that comes with you sharing those notes. So yeah, what was your thought process behind that? Were those first drafts, or did you take time to transcribe it onto another set, in a notebook?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, you know, I've visited a couple of different classes or universities recently, and I got excited about doing this, about sharing the notes, because yeah, I do think they're intimate, and I think, I don't know, I think the trace of the hand is really special for anything. And what was I going to say? So these are, let me look at them. For the most part, or at least from my memory, these are all first drafts. These are all from the moment of the initial conversation and experiment of walking to the place on this street where the poem was leading me. So yeah, and so I would often just sort of sit on a curb or write while standing up or something like that. And so I like that they kind of contain that rawness and the intimacy of them. And, you know, I suppose while you're listening to me, you can also look at those and see what I pulled out and how things got sort of moved around, etc. But there's some stuff there that I believe, I would have to like re-look back, but you know, I think I tried to retain a lot of it, and I think that practice of writing by hand outdoors after these conversations like felt very freeing to me as a writer. And there was something really, it felt like there was a lot of permission for the language, whatever language came to come. And I think as a writer, I always, you know, write within multiple steps, but one thing I did with this project, I think, was make those steps very, I don't know if I want to say concrete, but it's like, it's really emphasizing the multiple steps that a poem goes through before it decides to call itself a poem. And yeah, I think there was something about, it felt very different to be writing in that way than writing while like sort of hunched at my desk. It didn't feel like squeezing out language. It felt like rather kind of like pulling it, receiving it in some ways, if that. I'm sure there was some squeezing too. I don't want to be too idealistic, but different in that way. I think just changing, I don't know, just doing it differently allowed me to receive something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talked in your craft talk earlier today about allowing yourself and your poems to participate in the world in new ways through that project and other projects that you're working on. And so I kind of see that, like, that tactile, tangible page as also, I think, like a record of your participation, of that moment of participation. And I think that that's really neat. I have kind of a follow-up question to this also, to kind of bring it outward a little bit. I had noticed that you describe your poems frequently as collage, or like you say collage a lot when you're talking about poetry. And then when you did show us those like visual drafts, those handwritten drafts from Street Gloss, I noticed that some of the phrases appeared in the drafts, and then we could also hear them in the poem as you were reading it, but sometimes in a different order than we saw on the page, or like not everything on the page showed up in your poem. And so I'm wondering if you could talk more about the idea of collage and how you use that in your writing or drafting process. Not necessarily only in Street Glass, but also in your other poems, which, like, even like the tree poems that you were talking about, you said that you collage them together. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you accumulate language and then what happens in that process to become a poem.
Thank you. That's a great question. How does it happen? Yeah, I think so. I think what excites me about collage is the idea of creating meaning by putting things next to each other, or maybe not even creating meaning, but like allowing some sort of meaning to occur, um, to be suggested. And sorry. So I started experimenting with that a while ago, I would say. And it began in this fairly intuitive way where, I would just write down what came to me in like little phrases in my notebook, and I would just keep that with me. And then, once a week or so, I would pull from what I had and see if I could add something to it in order to allow it to speak, and see what it could say. And so there's that sort of intuitive practice. I will also do something, like with the tree poems, which are newer. What I would do is I would copy over my notes, and for each of them, and then copy them and sort of start shaping them into something that felt like poetic lines. And then I would move those lines around and write in between those lines, and then copy it over again. I know that you, Genevieve, are a fan of Brenda Hillman, and I am too. Just a firm believer, of copying things over by hand multiple times, in order to help shape the poem, and so that is something that I do, and then while doing that, I'll move stuff around. I don't know if I completely answered your question, but
Yeah, that was a great answer. I mean, I think it's there are a few questions in here about your writing process, and I know that you've talked a lot about process already, so maybe we'll get back to those. I know that you just mentioned Brenda Hillman, and I wanted to move over to Sarah, who had a question about other like inspirational poets, and things like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi. Okay, there it goes. Yeah, I was wondering, did you have any other poets as inspiration while you were first writing, And what's the average time you take on a poem? I know some people have a really long process and some people they write it right away and that's it. So, yeah.
oh my gosh, those are great questions. So who are some of the poets who've influenced me? Well, I feel like Brenda Hillman is a huge influence. I think like the sort of spiritual generosity of her work, and also the strangeness and the politics of the work, I love. Adrienne Rich, when I was in college, when I first read Adrienne Rich, I thought, this is what I want to do. And she was actually the first poet I read who engaged with politics in a way that felt really exciting and doing, I don't know, kind of opening up politics such that all of the human feelings that sort of circle around it could have space, if that makes sense. So she, as a poet, was super important to me. I talked about him a little bit this afternoon, but my first poetry teacher, Robert Kelly, I think the sort of combination of the sort of contemplative quality and the playful quality of his work really drew me in. This afternoon, I also talked about C.A. Conrad, and I just have to mention them again, because they come up with these amazing, they're just an amazing poet, and such one of these people who just lives poetry. And they have they use all of these amazing embodied rituals to create their work, and they're just really brave and wonderful. Who else? I mean, there's so many people to love. Those are some of them. But your other question was, oh, how long it takes to write a poem. I don't know. Years? Yeah, I mean, I think it takes me probably a couple of years to get to a place where I feel like the poem is ready. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm working on it constantly for those 2 years. I'm not. But I'm often, like I will start poems, work on them rather intensely for like a month, put it down and work on other things, return to that poem, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this sort of shifting, yeah.
Great, thank you. I wrote down some of your recommendations in the chat here so that everyone can check these out. And I know that we should wrap it up soon. I want to offer one more question. I think that I'm going to use your mention of C.A. Conrad and their work with the body to transition over to Ariel, who has a question for you.
Hello again.
I don't know.
So my question is, I'll just read it verbatim. Given that we are in a unique position with our COVID times, how do you think poetry about the body will change in the future? Because I know, especially for me, quarantining all the time, I've read some, I mean, it's kind of like divine, sort of like a divine spotlight where everything I'm reading is just connecting to this, like we're all isolated, but there's technology. Like I was reading Ariana Reigns, I just felt that. And I read your poetry, felt that same sort of like tension between technology and the body. I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
I think that's such a great, important question. I don't know. I think that we need poets to write about the body always, but I think what your question makes me think is that we really need them right now. Because there is this distance from each other. So how do we remain connected to the sensation of the body, the sensation of other bodies in proximity and connection to us, even in the midst of this distance? And so I feel like that's such an important job for poets right now. Also there's this fear of other bodies right now, which is really upsetting. And I think that's something that we need to spend time on. I mean, I think it's something for poets to work with, because we have to move through that. And, I mean, and as someone who sort of just has all of, came of age at the dawn of age, or came of age during the onset of AIDS, I can't help not to think about fear of the body, fear of infection, ideas about contagion without thinking about those things. And so I think the question you're asking, which is so important, like how do we celebrate the body? How do we not turn away from the body in this particular moment? And how do we, the other thing that is, kind of amazing and really important about this moment is how do we allow other bodies to be present to us, even if they're far away from us? And what I mean about that is like, how do we consider other bodies, right? Like, how do we consider what might happen to other bodies? So the sort of politics of care that are emerging in this moment. I don't know if I'm exactly connecting it entirely to poetry right now, but I think these are important questions for all of us to think about, and I think poets definitely we should be thinking about them.
Yeah, that's great. I think answering a question with a question at this point is like the perfect way to move forward. And probably, I think, also the best way to end our evening. So I want to thank you, Brent, so much for joining us and for sharing your poems and talking with us tonight. I want to remind all of you that Brent's books, The Ghost in Us Was Multiplying from Noemi Press, and Street Glass, which is out from the Operating System, are available for purchase. I've dropped these links in our chat here on Zoom, and we'll put them up on our YouTube page as well. And as always, I want to encourage you to support poets and poetry by purchasing books when you can. Our final Tabula Poetica event is a reading by Chapman University poets at 7 p.m. on Monday, December 14th. And I hope to see all of you again then. So thank you again, Brent. Thank you everyone for joining.